Senator Hinsdale.
Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 18th. It's 10:17 a.m. and this is a meeting in the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. It's week 3 and we're continuing our work on bills as well as taking in new bills. Along those lines, that we have a new bill, and that is S225, an act relating to the Vermont Climate Corps. We've asked the lead sponsor, Senator Hinsdale, to come in and tell us more about it, and then we'll do a bill walkthrough with council.
Thank you. I wondered, Jude, if I can have permission to share my screen. Oh, you already gave it to me. Thank you. So it's nice to be, for the record, Senator Kishorehinsdale from Chittenden County. It's nice to be back so soon in Senate Natural Resources and Energy. And I appreciate you doing a walkthrough of this bill and looking at it. We had started this discussion last session, I think, with a number of folks in this committee and beyond, because I see this as an area that really touches on so many different potential committees' jurisdiction, particularly at the intersection of economic development and natural resources and energy. And the idea that we need to create a green workforce and make sure it's a pipeline that's diverse, that's accessible to all Vermonters, including rural Vermonters, folks in mobile home communities, people who are English language learners, people of color, and people from a broad age categories as well. One of the things that Ellen and I talked about early on was, should we just make this youth focused? And I think there's room for a lot of different folks at the table to either reinvent or, have veterans participate in this growing part of the economy, and just to make sure it's place-based as well. So with that, the bill is only a couple pages right now because it's, pretty conceptual. We started a lot of conversations with organizations that are working on how to merge climate action and service, such as Vermont Youth Conservation Corps and Serve Vermont. But I wanted to get this conversation back on the table and work hand in glove with this committee to see if it's something we can advance, knowing that there's a lot of conversation about it at the federal level. So the bill would create a Vermont Climate Corps, focus on investment in green jobs at the entry level and transitional level to ensure a just transition into a new green economy. And the designated administrator of the program would be Serve Vermont, who have been part of these conversations. And certainly there are pros and cons to running a program through Serve Vermont due to some of the constraints that they have with how they, offer service positions. They can say more should it become relevant. Hopefully it becomes relevant. But at the same time, we did talk a lot about how a state program could help garner more resources so that we look at how to help folks transition into this new economy in a way that right now service positions can be pretty limiting because of the small stipend and because, it's a lot of service members would say they, have to draw from generational wealth or family support to be a service member, to be part of AmeriCorps or current Corps programs. And that makes it inaccessible in many ways to people who don't have that wealth or income to draw from other sources.
Do you happen to know, I know this is not your job, but do you happen to know about the financials related to serving in AmeriCorps?
I had a lot of those figures in my head last session because we were talking about essentially adding a housing stipend, which would not conflict with or interfere with the existing stipend that you receive. It certainly hovers around the federal poverty level, as I understand it. And there is an educational stipend that you get at the end, but in many ways, other programs we've seen around the country try to add other stipends such as for housing, which I had last year, the effort was to try and use some of the housing dollars to springboard into how can we help people with housing and rental assistance, but perhaps in a way where they can beautify and green up and weatherize their own community, similar to a program that I'll mention in a couple slides. And then, a lot of other programs around the country make sure there's wraparound dollars for career assistance, the ability to have a cohort and do learning as well, so that when you leave this program, you're highly eligible for a job in the renewable energy sector or the green workforce. Right. But I don't want to misspeak about the numbers. I think we all know it has really hovered around that federal poverty level and been really challenging for people who can't afford to do that or need to take care of other family members or have other obligations to participate.
Right. From that point of view, it seems like, a youth corps, because you may not have the financial obligations yet in your life that make it impossible for people with, unless they have other money to support them. Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to ground us in the timeliness of the conversation. President Biden signed an executive order last year seeking to establish a civilian climate corps. It was, parts of it were to advance in the Build Back Better bill. And so, there is some stalling out, but there's a lot of infrastructure being developed to try and roll out a massive job program in climate action. And as you can see, sort of the ways that it was spelled out by the president's executive order, it's aimed at conserving and restoring public lands and waters, bolstering community resilience, increasing reforestation, increasing carbon sequestration in the agricultural sector, protecting biodiversity, improving access to recreation, and addressing the changing climate. I think a really broad set of environmental priorities that we share in Vermont.
Right. Sounds like a modern CCC.
Right. That is, that segues really nicely into my next slide. The original CCC, the major knock on that program was it was almost exclusively open and available to young white men. So we have been talking to a lot of partners who, struggle with the language around a Vermont Climate Corps, Civilian Climate Corps, CCC, largely because it was an exclusive, it kind of intentionally exclusive in many ways program to help young white men get back to work. Obviously, the world has changed, and we can take some of that language and the principles of the program and apply them to today's world. But you'll see that other efforts have rebranded or renamed it so that it feels more accessible and open to all. Locally, you probably have heard from Vermont Renews and the Renew New England Alliance about such an effort to, as I quoted here, put thousands of New Englanders to work building affordable green homes, running local farms and community gardens, installing rooftop solar panels for low-income households, cleaning up pollution, and slashing carbon emissions that are causing the climate crisis. So really similar goals, really focused on public works in many ways, and with that environmental justice lens at its core. And I also wanted to share the example of Green City Force, because I think when you look at champions of the Civilian Climate Corps, from Senator Ed Markey to Senator Bernie Sanders to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, many of them are looking at this model out of New York City. And I know it's very hard to compare Vermont to New York City in many ways, but I think the unique lens that this program has put on service, and AmeriCorps service in particular, is tapping people in a place-based setting. So encouraging people from their own affordable housing community or their own neighborhood to participate in the program, which if you can't, increase the amount of resources you give to someone as much as you would like, you can at least say, you don't have to travel anywhere. You don't have to take, transportation. You don't have to have a car to be a service member. You can do this right in your community where you already have trust. And we see that model work very well. We've talked to VEIC and other energy partners who've said one of the things they feel is stopping us from more uptake of renewable energy sources and weatherization and efficiency programs in low-income communities is just trust. Who's going to be there when the installer leaves and you still have questions and you feel like something's going wrong? How do you build that sense, that an electric vehicle charging station is put in, but is it for you? And do you know about all the programs available to help you access an affordable electric vehicle? It really helps to have someone in your community, in your mobile home community, in your neighborhood, in your affordable housing community to answer those questions. And that's really been pioneered in New York.
One thing I would love to add to that list is tree planting.
Yes.
Lots of our towns have, between things like, emerald ash borer, so Bristol's in the process of tagging trees and taking them down. But I look at older, Bristol's a lovely town for how many trees it still has. But when I look at older pictures of Bristol, we have lost a lot of trees. And, it's part of the whole heat island problem. Why is Burlington hotter? In part because it's got less green space to soak up all that heat. Anyway, I don't want to take us off.
Exactly. Yeah. Riparian buffers, tree planting that's been a popular component even in the most urban of service corps and programs like this. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's a both and every community deserves to experience, beauty and spiritual value in nature as well. I made a long list, but I think it's also incomplete. I'm sure I'm leaving someone off who's been really important to this conversation we've been having over time. And you'll see some folks on there like BYCC, Audubon Vermont, Resource Vermont, who've already started an effort to try and partner on what service looks like moving into the future, which I think you know better than I do. I think even they would say that while they endeavor to be statewide, that takes a lot of resources and capacity that they don't quite have. I don't want to speak for them, but I think for this to really touch our rural communities, which would be critical, it needs to be a broader coalition and well-funded. So Serve Vermont, we've been having this conversation with, I didn't have time to tell them it's back on the table in this committee over the weekend. But I do think, they'd be ready to talk about the pros and cons of them administering it. Of course, Vermont Renews has already been engaging on trying to figure out the zones where we would want to really invest in green infrastructure and jobs. Certainly don't want to leave our mobile home communities behind. We talked about this last week in the environmental justice bill. This is an area where I think we could really do a lot of great work to pay people to beautify and support their communities, even talk about transitional supports to move to higher ground. These are ways that we can fund people to be having conversations in their communities about what communities want to be part of the environmental and climate action movement. Of course, housing trusts, the Vermont conservation districts reached out and said, we saw this on the agenda, don't forget us. And I think that speaks to your point, Senator Bray, about, tree planting, ecosystem repair. The energy community, as I mentioned, are really, trying to think about how they build trust in communities where they have the resources and the impetus, the mandate to support low-income communities, but aren't getting in there. And of course, some of our organizations that work specifically with women and people of color to help create a pipeline to diversify the green job movement and green workforce. And that I will stop sharing.
Last spring, as we were doing the weatherization bill and talking about capacity issues, it's the workforce challenge is across probably every area, but it's just felt more acutely in some areas than others. And so this will be helpful to us as a committee because I felt like we didn't have strong enough relationships with some of those partners that you just listed on that last slide. So, we're in recruiting mode really, right? It's like and to that point, so do you have a sense of how many people are sort of out there? we're always talking about a workforce shortage. Is it tough sledding to find people, do you think, for these programs, or do you think there is there's interest, but that people have not been asked and invited yet, or we haven't created a way for them to get involved, but there's a ready population wanting to get involved?
I think it's that last piece more than anything. And, of course, I would say to this committee, there are so many ways in which you've done a great job trying to build that pipeline. And what something Vermont, doesn't do well is make it really splashy and branded so that people who otherwise don't feel like this is for them or don't see themselves reflected, see it and think, of course, I want to be part of the Vermont Climate Corps or these green infrastructure zones or, a green workforce. You have to kind of be in the know. And for a lot of communities, there are barriers they face. And when they think of service positions, unless it's explicitly, if you look at the Green City Force website, they're very upfront about the services they offer and what you'd be getting and that your wage is above minimum wage. They just spell out for people that we will take care of you and we will make this work for you. And I think otherwise, by word of mouth, you hear from a lot of AmeriCorps, I'm eating ramen noodles, and like struggling to pay rent and living and sharing a room with somebody else. A lot of people, they just can't do that. And the word of mouth is, you have to really struggle through this first entry point into the pipeline. And for a lot of people, the struggles are too real for them to enter in that way. I would say VYCC and Resource and other partners are trying to change that, but the state really coming in and making the language explicit, I think really would help.
Yeah. I think, the people that we talked with that were particularly effective at reaching into a community that's interested but hasn't necessarily been engaged were the Office of Economic Opportunity offices, where they had a good presence, a long-time presence in local communities, and they knew the population that they're trying to reach and stuff like that, but we're still missing people. So are there any committee, so Senator Hinsdale, do you have anything more you want to add that's not in your deck? And
No, I had seen Senator Campion's hand before.
Senator Campion.
No, this is really interesting. So if I were, but I'm a little bit struggling with how to describe it briefly. I mean, sort of what is the, if you will, the elevator speech of how this would kind of work and take hold?
A state and federal partnership that makes service more accessible to more Vermonters in a way that allows them to either stay in their neighborhood and make a difference or enter the green workforce, at a place that's right for them with a lot of supports and services.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So is it creating in a way a new program, or is it more sort of putting in there into some of these other organizations and groups this kind of language and making certain that they are more open, if you will?
Most of what I've heard is, the $5 million that I, earmarked in this, which obviously change, would first need to go to helping the state have a federal partnership and conversation as the federal government sorts this out. As you may know, Serve Vermont is maybe like 2.5 staff right now. So just, knowing how to convene it, whether it's VYCC, Serve Vermont or others, convening stakeholders would take a position at the very least, creating this network. That convening a collaboration to build the infrastructure for this would take resources. And then hopefully a bulk of the money would go toward increasing the stipend and the support services that wrap around folks so that it's a more diverse, organization. Otherwise, you're really dropped into, ANR. I mean, ANR has eco AmeriCorps positions. You're dropped into anywhere from state government to a local nonprofit where, they are doing their best to support you, but many people might be uncomfortable saying, I don't have transportation to get there. This stipend is never going to work for me. So we'd be really creating a program that people have trust in. That's not a federal program kind of piecemealed into different organizations. It's I'm going to go to, the Vermont Climate Corps or whatever, we end up calling it, and figure out what the right entry point is for me and how they're going to support me to enter, the green workforce.
No, thanks for that. I appreciate it. It's interesting. I think we're going to be hearing a lot today from the governor as it relates to, career technical education. And I definitely see there's some real components in this that would be interesting as, if you're interested, as Senate Ed makes its way through what the governor's going to propose and some of the other work we're hoping to do with CTEs, maybe come down and see if there are ways to sort of kickstart parts of this, or there are parts that we share with this committee, or education just does it on its own. We're looking for bills from different committees. We always are. No, but seriously, there might be some overlap here as we look at CTEs and make certain that they're equipping young people to do some of this kind of work. I also just have to wonder if to get it going this year, it would be exciting to even at the very least get some of this going as pilots, for us to identify. I'm sure natural resources, and I'm sure the agencies could say that, DEC, the agency, and others could say, listen, these are the 5 communities where we really, it's like asking Secretary French where the pilot for the community school bills should go, He knew those 7, places. I think our environmental folks also could say, all right, this is really where we need to go. This is some of the work that needs to be done. And to kind of get things going that way could be really exciting.
You filled in a lot of gaps for me, as per usual, Senator Campion. When I talked about the intersection of this committee and economic development, that missing piece that I failed to mention was education. And if you look at some of these,
please, it happens. Please stop apologizing.
It kind of relentlessly happens.
No,
but,
thank you.
Yeah, and it's some of these programs around the country, especially Green City Forest, a missing link from what you just said that I really, really appreciate is they spend 3 or 4 days in service during the week, and they spend a full day in education, so that when they leave this program, they are highly eligible for jobs in the renewable energy economy, in the future of work. So I think that's been another piece where you can add some resources and maybe even build it. Great. So when you're piloting it and you're at that tech center or getting your technical education, you're half in the workforce, getting your educational pieces in, and it's branded in a way that people really feel it's accessible, in those pilot areas.
Definitely, because if they're getting the education and they're doing some of this work, it's such great sort of resume building too, to say, hey, I have this educational experience, but I've also been doing this work in this community.
Exactly.
And
like the environmental justice bill and Justice 40 being a big topic at the federal level, this is a way to say, to put a signal out, doing what we do best anyway, but putting a signal out saying, we're building a core that's equitable and accessible for rural Vermonters, for people who've been under-resourced and represented in the environmental and climate movement. So we're just sending that signal out, I think, as these resources continue to be discussed at the federal level. And, we have someone on the ground having that conversation with them already. But it's mostly, branding what we're doing already and adding resources so that people can truly serve.
I would just, if I may, Mr. Chair, just one final comment. I think also, I know a lot of young people are looking to, their biggest concerns, I would say right now, if you look at the country, democracy, making certain our democratic institutions continue, race and equity, and climate change. I think those are, and students, young people are really looking to do, it's frustrating right now. So how can they play a role in these 3 things? And they really are looking to do. I can't emphasize that enough. And I think particularly right now, as things are going the way they are there ways that we can help create some of these opportunities for them?
Exactly. Yeah. Some of you were here in 2008, 2009. I started in 2009 in the legislature in the free fall of the Great Recession. And so many of my friends who were couch surfing and didn't have healthcare, it was pre-Obamacare, a lot of things were falling apart, found access through VYCC and through environmental programs that really, we gave big grants to VYCC and others to expand jobs for young people quickly. And I think we're in that kind of moment, where people will otherwise feel left behind in our climate future, or this is the moment to build that pipeline and make sure everybody is brought along. So I completely agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. I think Senator McCormick, before going to Senator McCormick, I just want to follow up since we have the chair of education here. I mean, last year when we talked about creating a building science curriculum, so it was bigger than I need to learn how to weatherize. It was weatherization might be your entry point into a whole career in green building science, which really has a lot to offer. I mean, there's so many parts of it all. But it felt as though it was very hit or miss as to whether or not high school students would have access to that kind of a program. They would say, well, if you would ask us to put together a program, we could do that. But it didn't seem as though we had much of a, the governor talked about it a little bit, the sort of stigma of going, quote unquote, into the trades, even though we need many, many tradespeople. So I feel like this is a very, opportune moment for all of us to be talking about this, because we're in 3 different committees and we have a lot of shared interests between the workforce piece, the energy piece, and and building that pipeline for younger folks. It also seems like one more thing is that it seems as though, Senator Hinsdale, you're talking about a broader spectrum of activities than the building sciences piece, right? So beautification, cleanup, tree planting. I think it's great that you're also talking about being able to do it in your hometown. I mean,
Yeah, if I may, Senator Hinsdale, if I could just interject, one of the things that we keep talking about in this committee is, we are losing forests, we are losing trees every single day, thousands of acres. And is there something that young people and others can do, as bikes, electric bike, all sorts of things out there that we could get started by through this kind of work. Thank you.
Senator McCormick, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Thanks. How does this relate, and maybe it doesn't, but how does this relate to the Sustainable Jobs Fund?
That's a great question. Probably should, add them to the list of potential partners. We have just started this conversation with all kinds of partners, and I think they'd have a lot of lessons learned on that front. The entry point for folks into this, I think the Sustainable Jobs Fund, in my experience, kind of stays behind the scenes. When they look at a partnership like this, they might say, we're going to come in and help fund that and bring resources to bear on that. They might not hold the service piece of this, or make sure that folks were having the experience they needed. So I think they'd come in as a funding partner. I hope that they would. I think they would see the value of this and probably help even more so if, with the land access and agricultural piece of this. So I see them as a funding partner, not necessarily holding this. Some umbrella would make sense. The other partner that was at the table as we started this discussion that I left off the slide was Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. This really, it aligns so much with where we see the linkages between housing and conservation. And could they, hold the fund? Could they leverage with other partners like Sustainable Jobs Fund to hold this, while Serve Vermont, VYCC, and other organizations whose best work is creating curriculum and programming that serves young people well, particularly, or creates that pipeline for all folks, all comers, to help develop the curriculum and on the ground experience. So I think it's more of a grass tops funding and support, leveraging other dollars. Maybe Sustainable Jobs Fund that has a relationship with, USDA and other federal partners could help make sure there's a bridge between the civilian climate core idea at the federal level and our rural communities, and then work with our grassroots partners who would be ensuring the positive experience of young people and newcomers on the ground.
Another question. Have you ever heard from Matt Dunn on all this?
That's a great question. As somebody who, has a rural innovation network that's national now, based out of Vermont, and used to run our national AmeriCorps program, he and I have been engaging lately on their work, specifically around vital communities and helping to build digital communities. We haven't talked about this piece. It's a great idea. The list of partners could grow, and he knows better than most how to link the federal government to our rural communities.
Yeah. I think he'd have a lot to offer. Thanks.
Great. Well, we're gonna have no shortage of good thinking. Thanks, Senator McCormick, for bringing up Sustainable Jobs Fund, because this summer I said when it seems like part of our struggle here is we don't really have a systematic approach to things. We have fragments here and there, and we haven't pulled them together, funded them, helped each other. And when I think back to Farm to Plate, it wasn't about creating so much new entities, but it was about having a systems level view of the whole the world of food and agriculture, and then creating some coordination so that creating a virtuous circle. As one sector did better, it created opportunities for another. And I think it's still a very powerful model that's helped them a lot. And so Ms. Kaler was one of the people I wanted to talk to about how do you build such a network. And I think to what Senator Hinsdale was saying, Farm to Plate, I don't know, I guess you would say they do hold that, but it wasn't that they were managing it, but they were bringing together all the partners and facilitating the work. And one of our challenges in Vermont is we have so many innovative people that we'll do 60 different entities instead of having 2 or 3, So, all right, well, plenty of good stuff cooking here. And it's particularly timely because before you came in, Senator, we were talking about workforce being one of the biggest lifts for this committee on weatherization, workforce and funding. And it looks like we're actually going to be in good shape on funding for the next 4 years. But workforce is a much more organic challenge. You can't write a check for that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate you taking up all these topics, and particularly on, the day after Martin Luther King Day, and a week when we really reflect on the legacy of service, and think about who was, in the words of Dr. King, written a blank check in this country. How to right those wrongs has a lot to do with the conversations that you're having as we know that we're facing another big crisis that's in terms of our climate, that's either going to leave people behind in major heat and flooding events, or help them make their neighborhoods resilient. And so I just really appreciate you taking this up and making it a focus of this session.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Any other, you might want to get back to your committee. We're going to do an actual walkthrough with Ms. Chakowski, but if there are no more questions, don't want to hold you back. You're certainly welcome to stay.
I would love to, but we're talking about housing in my other committee. So
yeah, I'm sure. Okay,
thanks
again.
Thank you.
Okay, so Ms. Chakowski, can you take us through the bill itself, please?
Oh, I'm at the end. Yes, good morning. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. S225 is the bill that Senator Hinsdale was just describing for you. It is on your website today. And And it's fairly short, and I think she actually hit most of the points in it already, so it should be a good review. So section 1, we're adding new language in Title 10. If you decide to take up this bill and work on it further, we may need to look at, you may want to consider where to locate it specifically in Title 10. I went back and forth when choosing what chapter to add it to. This chapter I've added it to here, places it in the workforce development chapter in Title 10, but it could also potentially fit a few other places. So that's just a small sort of legal issue to consider. But so first is the definition section. So as used in this section, core members mean an individual who is at least 18 years of age and has committed to not more than 12 months of full-time, part-time, or flex-time service in the Vermont Climate Corps. Program host means a state entity, municipality, or nonprofit organization located or with a physical presence in Vermont that has committed to hosting core members through the Vermont Climate Corps. On to page 2. Serve Vermont means the Vermont State Service Commission, as required under Section 201 of the National Community Service Trust Act of 1993, as amended, and establish an executive order. Corps established. There is established the Vermont Climate Corps to be developed and administered by Serve Vermont. The purposes of the Vermont Climate Corps are to increase the opportunities for Vermonters to devote up to a year of service to Vermont communities, mobilize the service sector as an innovative solution to clear and pressing environmental problems that negatively impact Vermont communities, provide rural and underserved communities in Vermont with volunteer resources to help address critical health, human, public safety, educational, and environmental needs, and strengthen civic engagement of participants and communities through volunteer service. The following conditions shall apply to the Vermont Climate Corps. Serve Vermont may provide funding to eligible program hosts that have experience administering national service grants and engaging Vermonters in formal service programs in order to enable those hosts to support core members and undertake eligible projects. On to page 3, program hosts that receive funding from Serve Vermont through the Vermont Climate Corps shall use the funding received to meet costs incurred by hosting and supporting core members in their service who are participating in eligible projects. Core members shall be the responsibility of their program hosts and shall not be employees or considered to be employees of the state of Vermont for any purpose throughout the duration of their service. Serve Vermont and program hosts shall, to the extent practicable, ensure that core members are placed in projects that match their interests, geographic constraints, skills, and abilities. Program hosts shall seek to enroll as core members individuals who reflect the diversity of gender, racial, ethnic, sexual, social, and disability status of Vermonters. Project eligibility shall be determined by Serve Vermont and may include weatherization, environmental restoration, and other climate-related projects. Innovative strategies and partnerships are encouraged. In administering the Vermont Climate Corps, Serve Vermont shall coordinate with appropriate organizations in served communities, shall explore service-based solutions that build community capacity to combat climate change, and may engage with existing national service programs. And finally, on page 4, on or before April 1, annually Serve Vermont shall report to the General Assembly on the Vermont Climate Corps. Section 2 has an appropriation. The sum of $5 million is appropriated from the general fund to Serve Vermont in fiscal year 2023 for the purpose of administering Vermont Climate Corps. Within 180 days following the passage of this act, Serve Vermont shall seek to establish in 2024 the first class of core members. and it shall take effect on passage.
Okay. Any committee questions for council? So thank you. I've
Bless you.
no particular order, I suppose going backwards. The appropriation of $5 million was, do you know anything about, I mean, I should have asked the sponsor, but anything about where that figure comes from, et cetera? Or do you happen to know what the Serve Vermont current appropriation is?
No,
Okay,
not off the top of my head. I do know that I believe they received some additional funding last year in the budget. And they do obviously receive funding currently. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
right. Okay, well, it's, I was actually a little surprised to see that it dates all the way back to 1993, because I only hear about it episodically, and I thought it was much newer than that. So I've more to learn on that one for sure.
Right, well, so that refers to the federal program. And so Serve Vermont is the entity within Vermont that works with the federal core programs.
Okay. And it's do you happen to know about the funding? I mean, is this one of those federal and state match kinds of programs? Well, these, we can have Serve Vermont in and they can.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. There is a list on page 3 of, in terms of recruiting, seeking to enroll members who reflect the diversity of gender, racial, ethnic, sexual, social, and disability status. Are those all protected classes? And is there any protected class that we've omitted? Or is this larger than the set of protected classes in law?
Oh, you're testing my deep legal knowledge here.
Well, that's okay. We can come back to it.
So social, I don't think social is a protected class.
Right.
Economic status, is economic status in there? Economic status is also not a protected class. So maybe just the social is not a protected class.
Mr. Chair, is it your idea that you want to protect all the protected classes? That they should all be listed? Because I don't think this includes, I think age is a protected, age discrimination is verboten, I believe, and disability.
Right, disability is on this list.
It is
so
on
again,
the list.
So it's something to circle back to, but I just was trying to square up that list compared to the list of protected classes, particularly as we're trying to be more aware and sensitive to who we're inviting into programs or in general. So if you could maybe flag that and just help us, Ms. Czerkowski, like, how does this list compare to protected classes? And we'll come back to it for sure another time. All right. So I don't have any more questions about it. It'd be interesting to learn more. Serve Vermont, we ought to be talking to Serve Vermont regardless. They seem like actors in the arena that we're interested in anyway, in terms of helping people. This doesn't, in a certain way, reminds me of what Capstone does in terms of helping people who get training and enter the workforce and become one of their employees potentially, or get training and move on to a private contractor. And then another thing for us to come back to is, so I don't want to count any chickens till they hatch, but if it is accurate that we are going to be seeing something on the order of a large 4-year appropriation to support weatherization work, then one of the things we heard last year was the private market would supply many workers, but they have been reluctant to get involved because they're not sure what kind of commitment the state has to steady growth and implementation of weatherization. So is another 4 years on top of the first 2 years enough to start moving the market? I don't know. We'll have to loop back to those folks that we talked with. All right. Are there any other questions for Ms. Chakowski? All right. Thank you for the walkthrough. I think we are, unless there's anything more, we'll wrap it up there on introducing 225 and just have 10 or 15 minutes of discussion around planning for the next week, this week, next week, and the biennium more generally. Okay, thanks, Ms. Chakowski. So as we started to talk a little bit at the beginning of today, maybe before we went online, so I want to redo this while we're in a public forum. This week we're allocating 2 days to our Act 250 bill and really looking into the planning, the relationship with a focus on housing. And I'm going to say this now because some people might wonder, well, why aren't we talking more about green spaces, given that we're the Natural Resource Committee? But I think we all understand that if to the degree that we have smart growth and encourage development within our established communities, it takes pressure off of those green spaces to be nibbled away by development. The other thing is that we're all, I think, very aware that there's a housing shortage. And one of the things that gets laid at the doorstep of, I think, every planning process is that planning adds time and expense to a program. And I would say, well, there's certainly truth to that. What we want, though, I believe, and Act 250 plus municipal law is a testament to it. We want good planning in Vermont. So what we're interested in figuring out this week is, I think, what problem are we trying to solve on the housing development front, including affordable housing? And what's the role of planning related to it? Or to put it more plainly, S234, for instance, and I want to acknowledge Senator McCormick has a bill that also seeks to enhance the way that we can move projects forward. I think we're all interested in good planning, and we want it to be timely, efficient, and to not add unnecessary cost and expense. So the Senator Westman and I met with the Natural Resources Board and Agency of Natural Resources, having some background conversations in the last 2 weeks. And one of the things we were struggling with is to define the problem succinctly, not let sort of mythology around planning as a bad thing just be accepted as received wisdom. And so we're trying to short circuit it all the time. We want to support good planning. So the guests in this week are all oriented to helping us, I would say, engage in problem definition. How much housing are we looking to develop? How fast? What are the pressures that we're facing in terms of, for instance, ARPA money has a clock running. And so if we don't spend that money in a timely way, there's the risk of losing that money. Some folks are saying, well, therefore you should relax planning because you're going to slow down the development and lose those ARPA dollars. I don't know if that's an accurate assessment or not. And I don't know that anyone does. So this week, that's why we're having housing people in, as well as ANR, as well as the Natural Resources Board, to say, how much housing do we need? What is the nature of the demand in the near term? How is ARPA affecting the choices we're going to be making in the next 1, 3, 5 years? What are the long-term needs and how do we have a planning process that enhances and facilitates that kind of development, while also supporting, and again, I'm just saying it to bookend this, the maintenance and enhancement of our planning around green spaces. So that's why, for instance, 234, the second half of it, talks about bringing forest blocks into Act 250. Because it's, I think, well, we've talked about this at length in this committee. 75% of the state's land doesn't get that consideration in the Act 250 process. And we see that as a major weakness of the analysis. So that's what this week is about in terms of Act 250. Next week, we'll go on and hear, and let me pause. On Friday, we'll be back to environmental justice. As I've mentioned, there's been a whole group of people, including Senator Hinsdale, continuing discussions since S148 was introduced last spring. So there are new language proposals. There's been a back and forth between all these parties, as well as with ANR. I would say there's not consensus language to be offered yet, an entirely consensus effort, but I think there's been progress. So we will hear from those parties on Friday and ask Conservation Law Foundation to present the language that emerged out of that group. What will follow from that, I think, is that we will take testimony on that and put together a committee strike all. That sometimes sounds hostile to a bill sponsor, but Senator Rahm is fully on board with the strike all strategy for modernizing the language. So I just want to let people know about that. Then longer term calendar,